Before we get started, some of you didn't get a copy of last week's handouts, and my wife Beth has copies of them. So just raise your hand if you need a handout from last week, because the handouts are helpful for all three of our sessions. So Beth is going to get those ready for you. Just keep your hand up. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. Again, welcome to those of you who are online and all of you who are here at Our Savior's. Good to have you back with us. And for anybody that's new today, just a reminder that the sessions are on the Our Savior's YouTube channel on our website. So if you missed last week, you can check it out on the website. Today's topic is White Christian Nationalism Part 2, Separation of Church and State, Why the Founders Wanted to Keep Religion Out of Government. I wanted to start with this particular slide, and you'll recognize the gentleman, Charles de Gaulle, who was famous for his leadership during the war, during World War II, and then, of course, the post-World War II France. And he is famous for this particular saying, patriotism is when love of your own people comes first. Nationalism is when hate for people other than your own comes first. Let that soak in for a minute. The difference between patriotism and nationalism. Congresswoman Lauren Boebert of Colorado might struggle to pass a high school civics class. At a rally this past summer, she proclaimed, "The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. That is how our founding fathers intended it." Her statements represent an intentionally subversive interpretation of America's founding principles. Boebert made it clear that she was tired of this separation of church and state junk that's just not in the Constitution. Interestingly enough, there is a Council on Christian Nationalism that has been formed by the right-wing fundamental churches, and they have now drafted a statement about what they believe Christian nationalism is about. And I want you to especially look at this section where they talk about the denial of the separation of church and state. This is in their statement about what they believe. We deny that the separation of authority between the church and the state means there must be a separation of God and state. We further deny that there can ever be separation between religion and state. We deny the idea that a nation's laws do not impose morality and religion. Now think about the implications of that last statement. We deny the idea. In other words, we affirm that the nation's laws impose morality and religion on the people of this country, and particularly our version of morality and religion, which is why the founders tried to separate the two, right? Known for her support of conspiracy theories, Boebert and other politicians, including Marjorie Taylor Greene, Congresswoman from Georgia, express Christian nationalist views that erode democracy and violate fundamental constitutional principles of religious liberty in America. Christian nationalism has become a cultural framework that blurs the distinction between Christian identity and American identity, viewing the two as closely related and necessary to preserve the Union, that the two must be together. Columnist Jennifer Rubin suggests that Christian nationalists harbor a set of extreme beliefs that are at odds with our history and our pluralistic democracy. She reports that while most Americans embrace pluralism, 30%, mostly evangelical Protestants and most Republicans, remain animated by this vision of a white Christian America. She cites the PRRI poll referenced earlier in our sessions last week, indicating that those that are adherents or sympathizers of white Christian nationalism believe the following: the US government should declare America a Christian nation. 2, that US laws should be based on Christian values. 3, if the US moves away from our Christian foundations, we won't have a country anymore. 4, being Christian is an important part of being truly American. And God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. As we look at this idea of what America was supposed to be, this is an interesting poll. Was America the promised land for European Christians? And you'll note that those that completely agree or mostly agree, again, are adherents of Christian nationalism. Fortunately, most Americans either completely disagree or mostly disagree. But you could say about 67% of most Americans, compared with those who are adherents or sympathizers of white Christian nationalism. What about the fact that God has granted America a special role in human history? And you look at this by religious affiliation. If you look at all Americans, which is the bottom one, only 16% suggest that that's true. White evangelical Protestants, 68%. And again, it just shows you the trend line from 2013 to 2022. A stunning percent, 90% of Christian nationalists think that God intended America to be the new promised land where white European Christians could create a society that would be an example to the rest of the world. The problem is that the founders never intended to establish the United States as a predominantly Christian nation. In fact, coming from Europe, where the state religion was common, and particularly in England, where the king was head of the church, they did not want religion to interfere with or influence their newly formed democratic government. And I like this slide that says, our founders did not flee a religious monarchy just to build an evangelical theocracy. Christian nationalism is based on the myth that the American Republic was founded as a Christian nation. It asserts that the legitimate government rests in adherence to the doctrines of a specific religious, ethnic, and cultural heritage. In other words, fundamentalist white Christianity. One looks back on a fictionalized history of America's allegedly Christian founding. Andrew Siddell, in his book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American, suggests there are two facts to dispute this claim. Fact one, that religion is absent from our constitutional identity. And fact two, God is not responsible for America. The founders are. The honor belongs to those who founded this nation, And we need to understand what they were thinking when our nation was created. Let's remember the context of America's founding. Consider the fact that the American colonists came from Europe, where the church dominated politics. For centuries, the Pope was seen as more powerful than kings and even the Holy Roman Emperor. There was no separation between church and state. In fact, if you go to some of the cathedrals in Europe, you'll note that at one end of the cathedral is the place for the Pope. At the other side of the cathedral is a place for the king or ruler of that nation or country. There was no separation. In some cases, a theocracy of a certain religious bent governed people, such as Calvin's Geneva. And in England, where the monarch, as I mentioned, is considered the head of both church and state, which is yet true today. The nation's founders wanted to ensure a separation of the two and avoid early American experiments, such as the Puritan rule in Salem. You recall that was the home of the famous witchcraft trial. And did you know that in 1659, the Puritans made it illegal to celebrate Christmas in the colony? They felt that due to the holiday's pagan origins, celebrating it would constitute idolatry. At that time, a small minority forced its religious views on the majority of the population. And consider what is happening in our country today. The courts have allowed employers to withhold medical benefits, such as contraception, from their employees if it violates the religious views of the employer. Businesses such as florists and bakers can discriminate against LGBTQ plus individuals if it offends their religious sensibilities. In Florida, the governor has asked the State Education Commission to expand the Don't Ask, Don't Tell law, which prohibits educators from talking about sex or gender issues up through the 12th grade. Missouri and South Dakota have prohibited districts from adopting policies meant to protect LGBTQ students from bullying. In Tennessee, Governor Lee rejected $8.8 million in funds to assist AIDS patients. This is what happens when religious liberty is misconstrued as an individual's right to impose their values on others, rather than to respect our religious differences and to worship without government interference. It appears that founders sought to erect a wall of separation between religion and government that they created. Our Constitution is deliberately godless in that there are no references to gods or goddesses or divine intervention. Supernatural power is rejected in favor of the natural power contained in the words, we the people. We the people. The Constitution's only references to religion are exclusionary. It excludes the state from involving itself in religion and excludes religion from involving itself in the state. We read that the great American experience here to establish a truly secular government, and so they have inserted that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The idea of a government separate from religion comes from the Enlightenment's period teachings of such people as John Locke, Voltaire, and others. This was the great American experiment, establishing a truly secular government. No other nation had sought to protect the ability of its citizens to think freely by separating government from religion and religion from government. America was the first to try this. The founders recognized that religion can be exploited for political gain, and that religion, when it has civil power, can be deadly. George Washington thought religion was best left to the private sphere, for it was a personal matter. He stated, "No one will be more zealous than myself to establish effectual barriers against the horrors of spiritual tyranny." Thomas Jefferson agreed, suggesting that legislature make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise of religion. He's the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which was a model for our First Amendment. The law ensured, number one, no government support of religion. Two, the government couldn't take away a person's rights because of their religion. And three, religious tests for public office were prohibited. James Madison argued that the separation existed as much to protect religion as to protect government. For Madison, the tendency of government and religion to mix and corrupt each other was so great a danger that it could not be too carefully guarded against. He said, "State and church will exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together." Let me say that again. The state and church will exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together. He voiced opposition to establishing Anglicanism as the state church of Virginia and was a zealous guardian of religious liberty. And what about Ben Franklin? He vigorously supported the rights of religious freedom, speech, and assembly that were ultimately incorporated in our Bill of Rights. And he said, "What one believes about God is not as important as living a life of love." What one believes about God is not as important about living a life of love. Christian nationalism is not unique to America. There was an article in the April 7th issue of Christian Century titled "The Ones Who Didn't Resist," about the chilling parallels between Christians in Nazi Germany during World War II and what is happening in America today. The truth is that good Christian people supported Nazism because it benefited them and seemed to reinforce the cultural values that gave meaning to their lives. They believed that God was in control and had blessed their culture and their leader for special greatness, and that outsiders and foreign influence needed to be subjugated or eradicated in order for Germans to protect themselves and know true prosperity. Many welcomed Hitler because they believed Germany needed a strong man sent by God to beat back the threat of communism and other dangerous forces. We might say the same about those in this country who are threatened by a growing secularization of America and the perceived loss of Christian values. Not only do they pine for a strong leader who will save America for God, but a growing number suggest a theocracy would be preferable to our current form of democracy. To view history in this way is to engage in a triumphalist retelling of the story of a dominant culture that marries a particular religion to the politics of the nation state. History demonstrates the fruits of Christian nationalism, whether in Nazi Germany or America today, that are horrific, descending into harsh rhetoric and even violent means to maintain power. A recent poll indicates that 29% of all Americans and 54% of Republicans endorse the idea of an authoritarian leader, one who is willing to break some rules to make things right. A hero of the Republican right, Hungary's authoritarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban argues that the principle of equality in liberal democracy actually undermines countries by attacking the national culture. And he calls for an end to multiculturalism. An end to multiculturalism. He would prefer to have everyone be the same. A number of today's Republican leaders seem to agree that the American virtue has been eroded by progressive social advances. They believe such a loss must be combated by a strong government that enforces religious values. And this could mean the end of democracy. For according to Heather Cox Richardson, if democracy is a threat to their version of the nation, it follows that any institution that supports democracy should be destroyed. Katherine Stewart, in her book, Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, writes, America's Christian nationalist movement has been misunderstood and understated. The religious right has become more focused and more powerful, even as it has become less representative of the nation's populace. It is not a social or cultural movement. It is a political movement, and its ultimate goal is power. She concludes, Christian nationalism does not seek to add another voice to America's pluralistic democracy, but rather to replace our foundational democratic principles and institutions with a state grounded on a particular version of Christianity. It is not a culture war. It is a political war over the future of our democracy. Ever since the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, there has been a white flight from our public schools to private schools or homeschooling. And much of those in the homeschooling movement are white evangelicals who embrace Christian nationalism and teach revisionist history, including the myth that America was founded as a Christian nation favored by God. So I want to talk about the impact of Christian nationalism on education and our youth today. Pastor Raphael Cruz, the father of Ted Cruz, suggests that the moral downturn in America began 6 decades ago when the U.S. Supreme Court banned mandatory prayer and Bible readings from schools. And he suggests that a solution is to restore these religious traditions. And then Cruz says, to do that, we need to make sure that we have strong, committed Christians in every position on every school board in America. Think about that. We want to have strong, committed Christians of a certain ilk on every position on every school board in America. Project Blitz is a conservative movement espousing Christian nationalism in public schools with the stated purpose, quote, to protect the free exercise of traditional Judeo-Christian religious values and beliefs in the public square, especially public education. They have been lobbying state legislatures and promoting a Christian model for public education. One is an elective on biblical literacy because they believe youth need God's word in order to survive and thrive in an anti-Christian culture. These electives on biblical literacy have already been now passed by legislatures in Oklahoma and Arkansas, and other states are considering it. 2 is required postings of a banner stating, "In God we trust." And it's a banner that has been passed in a dozen states. 3 is restoring prayer to the classroom. And then there was the Hillsdale College Project to Defend Liberty Nationwide by Reaching and Teaching Millions. And they have a 1776 curriculum with the goal of placing it in every school district in America to restore excellence in K through 12 education, their own 1776 curriculum. And several states have already banned books across their state libraries, school systems. Mentioned last week, about 2,500 titles have been banned across this country. The religious life, the religious right seeks to enforce a certain version of morality and faith in every corner. And I like this quote from Stephen King. Book banners, after all, insist that the entire community should see things their way and only their way. When a book is banned, a whole set of thoughts is locked behind an assertion that there is only one valid set of values, one valid set of beliefs, one valid perception of the world. It's a scary idea, especially in a society which has been built on the ideas of free choice and free thought. Again, here's some of the points that we were talking about. And Diane Butler Bast believes that white Christian nationalism is a threat to the children of America. She writes, church, school, and library are under assault, mostly by religious and political fundamentalists seeking to undo reciprocity and trustworthiness and replace them with authoritarian power and propaganda. For generations, these have been the building blocks of a more democratic and egalitarian America. And it says, sure, they've never been perfect, but now they are under attack because they've worked. So what have we learned? So much for revisionist history that claims that those colonial leaders sought to inject their religious principles into our nation's founding documents. The evidence seems pretty conclusive that America's founders were adamant about keeping religion and government separate. Even the Declaration of Independence and its proclamation of liberty and justice for all was based more on reason and the aspirations of our founders than on any religious teachings. And note, the Pledge of Allegiance was adopted in 1923. The Star-Spangled Banner was adopted in 1929. Under God was added to the pledge in 1954. In God We Trust was added to our money in 1956. And so no, they were not created by our founding fathers. This is not a Christian nation. However, it is a nation in which you are free to be a Christian. Revisionist history wants to ignore this truth. If America is truly a nation based on Judeo-Christian principles, it becomes hard to deal with the things in our sinful past that makes us uncomfortable. And we can end up denying or ignoring the truth. For Christian nationalism is a pathology rooted in America's past. It's a fraud that the US was founded as an American Christian nation, or that God favors us above all other nations. The wall of separation between church and state is not a latter-day fiction concocted by secular liberals, as Christian nationalists would have us believe. It is a principle written into our history as a core achievement of the American Revolution. And we need to reclaim the genuine religious freedom that our founders established and most of our citizens still cherish. Christian nationalism is a threat to a pluralistic democratic society. As Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun once remarked, a government cannot be premised on the belief that all persons are created equal when it asserts that God prefers some over others. Christian nationalist ideology is fundamentally focused on gaining and maintaining access to power. It seeks to ensure that one particular group with one specific vision for the country enjoys privileged access to the halls of power and has the ability to make the culture into its own image. It fuses national and religious symbols and identities in an attempt to legitimate its desires for the country. There's no room for disagreement or compromise. It demands complete allegiance, even worship. In rejecting Christian nationalism, we are in fact preserving religious liberty for all our citizens, whatever their beliefs. While some fear we are losing a Christian foundation, we must remember that we are founded as a pluralistic nation where all religious ideas were to be valued and protected. We cannot remain silent to the danger posed by this movement, just as Bonhoeffer could not remain silent in Nazi Germany. And I really appreciate his statement. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. And so how do we respond? How do we deal with this danger? And what about those who espouse Christian nationalism? A dramatic transformation would likely need to happen for this movement to return to pluralistic policies and politics. Jennifer Rubin suggests the MAGA crowd would have to recognize America's complete history, reflecting our full experience, not just the story of people like them. And most important, she says, they would need to rediscover the principles on which the United States was founded, that all are created equal. They would have to abandon the myth that America is the domain of one race or one religion. Well, there are several things that we can do to help heal our nation. First is to share openly our concern about this dangerous movement with friends, neighbors, family. Remember, only 29% are in that category that are adamantly kind of embedded in this Christian nationalist ideal. There's a lot of people that are struggling to understand it. We can engage our friends, our neighbors in this conversation. In doing so, it's important that we approach others with a spirit of care and concern, not one of confrontation. And it's good to model respectful civil conversation that requires us to listen as well as to educate others. There are a number of organizations that are doing just that. There's a group called Braver Angels. In fact, there's a Seattle chapter. They call this the kind of the red state, blue state organization where they bring people from both sides for conversation around mutual topics, teaching them how to have civil conversation with one another. There's another organization called Resetting the Table, which encourages courageous communication across the divides. You can find these using Google on your computer. Another group called Listen First Coalition. Another one, the Center on Faith and Justice at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. So these organizations have all sprung up just in the last couple of years because they see the need to help people reach across the divide and find ways to bring people together. A second thing we can do, we need to have our schools teach democracy as part of a robust course on civics. This would be a nonpartisan course where the central ideas of American democracy are taught: individual rights and liberties, equality, justice, the rule of law, as well as the checks and balances in government. We also need to teach an American history that has not been whitewashed. Students need to know the whole truth about our history, the good and the bad. And to accomplish this, we need brave educators and open-minded parents. And finally, it's important to remember that our unity as a Christian community is not dependent on uniformity. That is, marching in lockstep to the same drum. We are a people of diverse opinions related to politics, religion, and life. We need to celebrate that diversity, remembering that what unites us is not our theology or our morality, but as Christians, it's our baptism into Jesus Christ. And with all faith traditions, what we have in common is a desire to banish the darkness with the light of God's love. And so I conclude with this slide from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. For though my faith is not yours, and your faith is not mine, if we are free, each free to light our own flame, together we can banish some of the darkness of the world. So I'd like to open it up for questions and comments. Again, I know this is kind of like a fire hose today. A lot of information. Please.
I think it's important that we do open, talking with people of all different religions and races, and because you put up their light when you don't allow their family to do those. And I have friends that are so many different religions, and they love my life with the goodness that they bring and to this earth. And I would hate to see their lights be, put out because they bring so much. And we do too as Christians, but we all need to be heard and be a great light.
So the comment is that we need to make sure that we're not putting out other people's light by putting them down or refusing to hear what they have to share. That people of various faith traditions have their own light to share. Is that a fair summary? That we need to listen to one another and affirm one another.
Right. Love one.
And love one another. Other comments and questions? Yeah, please.
Is it a fair comparison to say that?
I'm going to give you the mic to answer the question so that people lining can hear you.
Just asking, is it a fair comparison to say that Christian nationalism wants this country to be like Iran, to declare it an Islamic state? Years ago, as they did, we would declare ourselves to be a Christian state. Clerics, ayatollahs, and others would govern the country, and as they do in Iran, and evangelicals and clerics would govern this country. Is that too far?
I think that's very fair. I mentioned the 2025 project, and theocracy is a part of that we have a particular state religion that's dictating the policies of this country. And in some ways, it's an authoritarian view versus a democratic view of what our nation would look like. I think that's a very good comparison. It would take a while to get to that point, but it's certainly the dream of some that are in the Christian nationalist movement.
What is interesting is when you look at the history of a state, our Christian state nationalism, when you go back to the Reformation era, one of the primary things that they started, if you remember that Germany was not a united country, Germany was a bunch of principalities. And their way to separate religion was the religion of the prince, the ruler of each of the little principalities, was going to be the religion of the whole principality. So if they became Lutheran, if the prince was Lutheran, everybody had to be Lutheran. If the prince was Catholic, everybody had to be Catholics. If they were Reformed, they had to be Reformed. And so, and it even carried forward into the founding of the colonies. Like, he spoke a little bit about Massachusetts. Massachusetts persecuted the Baptists and everything else. They grew up. That's the reason Rhode Island was founded. There were people from Massachusetts moved to Rhode Island and William started Rhode Island so that they would have freedom to worship, brought the Baptists to there. And so that's, if you really look at the history, you can see that these kinds of things happen, and we need to make sure that this doesn't become that.
Reference was to the 30 Years' War in Europe after the Reformation in 1517, where there was this big uprising and princes were fighting against princes, Catholics against Protestants, and the way that the peace came about and the war was solved was, again, whoever your ruler was, that was your religion. So whatever country you found yourself in, or whatever fiefdom or princedom you found yourself in, you had to have be that religion. And so there was a lot of religious persecution that took place in Europe, which is why many of the colonists came to America to be able to freely practice their religion, only to find themselves in colonies that were restricting a particular practice of religion. And so you can see why the founders said there's got to be a separation between church and state. We cannot dictate a particular religion. And when the Anglicans were dominant in Virginia, and there was an attempt by the legislature to establish Anglicanism as the official religion of that colony, James Madison was one that stood up and said, there's no way that's going to happen under my watch. So you can see where our founders were wanting to provide that freedom of religion for people of all faith traditions, so that no one religion would dictate or dominate. Thank you.
Thank you. With 29% of modern Americans being Christian nationalists, that's a pretty large block. So what is the reason for their motivation? What do they really want? I mean, they say they want all these things, but what's behind it?
Well, I hope that I've shared a little bit about their motivation. It's as we talked about, there is a fear that America has lost its moral grounding from their point of view. And they want to restore God to America. They want to restore their particular sense of morality to America. That's why the state legislators are passing laws about certain both educational restrictions, books that can be read, passing laws against transgender care, and there's been some, I forget now, quite a number of laws that are under consideration about restricting the rights of LGBTQ plus people in a number of states. So it's to establish kind of this sense of America being a Christian nation with a particular sense of morality. In fact, many of them would like to kind of roll the clock back to, I think, 1950 or earlier. because they see that I mentioned that the advances the social advances in this country are to them a threat to their understanding of Christianity and what it means to be a Christian. So we're going to talk about that in a lot more detail next week.
I don't need a microphone, but I just wonder if the country they're trying to get back to ever existed.
That's a good question. The question is, did the country they want to get back to ever exist? You have a question, Jennifer?
I think some of their motivation is fear, but I'm gonna make a really judgmental comment, so forgive me. The people that seem to talk the loudest, I don't think are showing by their actions very much morality themselves. And so their constant call for more morality doesn't go well with me, and their lack of love and compassion does not show any sort of Christianity to me. So I have a really hard time accepting that they want to get back to any kind of a Christian nation.
Thank you for your comment. Well, last week we talked about the fact that their view of Christ is kind of a militant and judgmental Christ. And we're going to talk about the contrast some more next week. Rather than a Jesus who is a Jesus of love, compassion, care, the Jesus that at least I know in our Gospels, and Jesus that was very much into social justice, and calls us, to care for and love all people, regardless of our differences, rather than being judgmental and exclusionary. I sense that we are representing a Christian faith that is inclusionary, that we want to include and embrace all people and love all people, following Jesus' example. Again, we're going to talk about some of those contrasts next week in more detail. Other comments or questions?
I think another root cause of white Christian nationalism is fear of people who don't look like, frankly, most of us in this room. Fear of people of color and the demographic increase of people of color and immigrants and refugees who, in my opinion, we need to welcome more of, not build walls against. So I think it's that fear of the other that is driving a lot of this.
Absolutely. The fear of people who are different, the fear of, as we look around this room, the fear of losing our white privilege as we become a nation that's much more diverse. The state of California now is 45% Caucasian and 55% other. Soon this country will reflect, what starts in California seems to come to the rest of the country, right? But seriously, it's that fear of the other that people who have different religions, different cultural expectations, there are a lot of concerns on the part of white Christian nationalists that our way of life, our belief, our privilege is going to be in danger.
Just a very brief comment. Values are fundamentally important because values drive behavior, and behavior defines our community. There are good, positive values, and there are negative values.
said, there are positive values and there are negative. Other comments or questions? We are at just a little bit past the hour, and so we'll wrap this up again. Beth has the handouts from last week. If you didn't get one and you'd like to have the handouts from last week, just raise your hand before you leave. And we'll look forward to having you join us next week. And I want to say thank you again to the folks at Shepherd of the Valley and others online for joining us. Good to have you with us, and we'll look forward to hopefully having you with us again next week. God bless you in the week to come. Thank you all.